Hello and welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. I'm Tony.
I'm Patrick.
And today we are continuing our discussion on Craig Keener's book here. And it is, Patrick will probably have it up in the Miracles, the Credibility of New Testament Accounts. We're looking at chapter 6. This is part 1. And we started looking at this chapter a couple of times, actually this portion, part 2, a couple of weeks ago, and so we're working our way through. And we like this portion because it's really philosophical and it's dealing with David Hume and his various arguments. And Keener points out the importance and the influence that Hume had with regard to modern day approaches to miracles, at least, before the previous 20 or 30 years. It's a little bit different, he suggests now, but Hume had a tremendous influence. And so we're working our way through these. I think there are 3 chapters in this particular section about Hume and his ideas with regard to miracles and how many academics followed Hume and his arguments against miracles. We're at the chapter 6. And it's entitled Developing Hume's Skepticism Toward Miracles. And he tells us that in the previous chapter, he noted that Hume's argument, or at least its frequent application against miracles, and then he kind of gives us the kind of a summary of the argument. It goes something like this. Miracles are as violations of nature more incredible than eyewitnesses and their interpretations can be trustworthy. And therefore, no evidence can prove persuasive for miracles. So that's kind of the basic idea he tells us of what Hume was talking about. And he says that he concurs with many that this argument is circular, right? Even granted something like Hume's definition of miracles that has to do with they violate the laws of nature, right?
Yeah. And you don't have to accept his definition. It's fine to even argue about that among philosophers. Who knew that philosophers would argue against simple things like definitions?
Definitions, go figure, right? And he also suggests that Hume's case was more persuasive in a context which miracles were rarely claimed or accepted among Hume's intellectual peers than it should be today. And so in this chapter now, chapter 6, this Developing Hume's Skepticism, he tells us he's going to survey some continuing developments of the philosophic tradition against miracles to which Hume contributed, as well as to some questions raised by Hume, but he's not some that he didn't get to in the previous chapter. So that's what he wants us to get out of this particular chapter.
So he kicks off with the consequences and problems of Humean consensus. So he starts off by saying the sort of arguments articulated by Hume eventually become dominant in much of the academic philosophy with far-reaching effects. People are still talking about Hume today, and from both sides of the aisle in this case, even for presuppositionalism, we tend to rub Hume in people's faces as well because of some of the concessions that he's forced to make for his philosophical standpoint, and because so many people hold him in high regard. And of course, in previous episodes, we looked at how some people during his time didn't really hold him in high regard. But regardless, as he's become the predominant person to kind of emulate, then it's only fair for us to hold him up and see what he's about. So that's why it's important that we address him and his arguments. So he's going to then talk about some of the effects in this chapter of Hume and his philosophy. All right, well, what were the effects in philosophy? Lest we think that skeptical currents of thought such as Hume's had little practical effects, the gaps between the Enlightenment elite and more traditionally religious masses affected, among other areas, the treatment of mental illness.
Go figure, right? So, this, if it wasn't sad, it would be funny. When you look at what he's going to say here, you know.
Among the poor confined to asylums, patients who insisted that their torments were spiritual afflictions were liable to have their beliefs numbered among their symptoms. Both John Wesley and George Whitefield secured the release of individuals from such asylums who they believed to be merely religiously devoted. 90 patients admitted to Bedlam between 1772 and 1795 were said to be insane because of religion and Methodism.
So if you're a Methodist, you're insane, right?
you might be able to convince me of Methodism as being a mental. No, I'm completely joking. But I do know, like our current DSM puts forth the fact that you could have a symptom of mental illness, of being overly religious to the point of this type of insanity. Now, whether or not these people had the same quality tends to be argued here. But even our current day, with taking the Atheist Handbook, a book that I've done a text review on, where the author has put forth the idea that if you have faith, if you claim to really believe in an invisible God, then you should be treated likewise and locked up in mental asylums.
Wow.
Now that's what, like half the population of America, of the world. So, let's put all the sane people maybe away, and then us insane people can live without them. So,
yeah.
So this is one of the effects then of Hume kind of having his upper hand and influencing people during his time of committing the faithful to insane asylum.
My goodness, yeah. He goes on to say that better known effects are those on the development of religion and philosophy. Enlightenment thought has often identified scientific, he quotes, and scare quotes there, as true and unscientific as false. And so modern thought's simultaneous a priori exclusion of the supernatural from the domain of science taints supernatural approaches with the suspicion of falsity and irrationality. And he says, yet such identifications unfairly load the deck epistemologically, right? So, science gives us rationality, and if it's unscientific, then it's probably false. And of course, religious beliefs, supernatural approaches are not scientific, and therefore the assumption is they must be false, right? So there it is, right? He says that this radical Enlightenment approach continued into the 20th century. Early 20th century logical positivists, accepting only a priori truths or empirically verifiable ones, excluded metaphysics, normative ethics, and theology. Metaphysics, ethics, and theology were all excluded by the logical positivists because they were not empirically verifiable. We couldn't sense them, right? We couldn't experience them with our sense perceptions. And of course, the logical positivist said you couldn't do that, and they weren't tautological statements, then they were meaningless statements. And so ethics is thrown out the door, theology is thrown out the door, all of metaphysics is thrown out the door.
Yeah. So, for them, probably nothing important lost. But this is what I always have issues with the early days of science fiction. Is my contention is always that people like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov were the gatekeepers, even though they themselves were ostracized people. And then they wrote fiction and approved science fiction to come in. And their contention was just religion just kind of fades away. You just have enough buildup of futureness or science, and then just it takes a back seat. Now that just completely wipes out all of human history of caring about things like good and evil and religion, and how about who we are as people. And so you have all three of them being wiped out here. And we also see that within early 20th century science fiction as well. So, Hume may take some blame for the good sci-fi, but we can also give him for some of the bad sci-fi too. All right. So the value of positivism is its empiricism, but one can utilize the empirical approach for this sort of data it was designed to address without thereby excluding every other epistemological approach, such as abstract mathematics or even questions about epistemology itself. So we were kind of talking about beforehand is if you show the logical positive himself in the mirror, well, he fails to be able to see himself using his own standards. So we can do the classic postmodernist approach of there are no absolutes. Are you absolutely sure? Therefore, you rub yourself out. So you yourself can't hold yourself to your own standards. So that's
the empirical verification principle isn't empirically verified, right? So that caused them to crash and burn. Right?
Yeah, it just took a little bit because of how much influence they had. Well, traditional scientific empiricism involves knowledge that can be replicated experimentally there. But if all knowledge were limited to this approach, there would be little place for historians, journalists, and members of other professions working with different forms of human knowledge. Now, maybe we can do without the journalists, but let's at least let the historians have a place at the table. So
and so this is an important point, right? When you have this kind of what often is called scientism, where science, scientific statements are the only truth statements, right? Then that wipes out a huge amount of source of knowledge that we have, right? History, all historical statements are wiped out, and, other professions that deal with it, mathematics, quite frankly, can be wiped out using
Right.
this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it gets us into all kinds of problems when we narrow our focus and say only scientific empiricism gives us knowledge. Well, what about all the rest of the things that we have, that we're full of, that allows for knowledge? Yeah, real narrow focus, and it puts us in a box, and quite frankly, put them in a box, the logical positivists, and that's why it kind of crashed and burned.
Right. So you can have the big questions like, all right, maybe this approach can help us determine when life begins, but it can't help us to determine whether or not we can execute life before birth. So with the abortion, or how about just even simple things? You're walking along, you have $5 in your pocket, and you really want that coffee. Should you spend that $5 now, or wait to put that money towards the purchase of a house? So, how do we titrate this? How do we do a scratch test? What atoms do I have to put together in order to determine which one I do here? So
right. Science can tell us how to make a bomb, but they can't tell us whether or not we should use it, right?
That's a good one.
Ethical issue,
right.
Yeah.
So then he goes on to conclude here that one cannot justify an exclusively experimentalist epistemology by experimental means. So, it faces itself in front of the mirror, and like a vampire, it can't see its own reflection, and therefore it should scare itself away there.
Right. And so he says, partly for these reasons, many philosophers today readily distance themselves from positivism and positivist epistemology. The movement's wane in professional philosophy did not, however, he tells us, immediately offset its effects in 20th century historiography, nor did it neutralize all of this approach's common legacy of prejudice against religion, right? So even though the movement waned and fell out of favor, the residue of it influenced history and religion. And that's what he's getting at here. All right. And so he tells us at first he wants to turn to the impact of philosophic skepticism on religion and theology.
All right, so what were those effects? The impact of Hume, Kant, and positivists on discomfort with miracles and other transcendent claims remains in some theological circles, although much ground has been taken back by those working in philosophy of religion and philosophical theology. And we have that even with we have that with determinism and free will movement. Everyone was a determinist at some point until people who took their theology seriously, fought back against it, or the different theodicies, right? So the problem of evil is almost wiped out, and people still utilizing it aren't the people in the ivory towers. They're the people still fighting about whether or not good is good and evil is evil in the streets. So within academia, you tend to have lost the argument, but the impact is still there.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay. The strongest impact on religion, however, was felt in centuries between skepticism ascent and its more recent travails. On a religious level, 18th century English deism was more than ready to accommodate the argument of Hume and others for anti-supernaturalism, which makes sense. Hume was utilizing a lot of their argumentation. You could still have, a God enter the picture at first, but like the blind watchmaker, he winds up the universe and steps back away. And so you can still have even a social gospel message there, but a fully kind of Protestant 20th century evangelical expression of faith tends to not happen here. So of course the deist would harp on and hitch their bandwagon to Hume. 19th century religion directly absorbed such a worldview into naturalistic German Protestant liberalism. Right. And, we've covered enough of German Protestant liberalism on the show and in books as well. We're still having to deal with that impact, even on our bibliology as well.
Right. He says naturalistic approaches to religion grew quickly. Right. For example, Hendrik Paulus in 1761 to 1851 offered naturalistic explanations for gospel miracles. Right. So, for instance, the healings merely befitted the ill person's nervous system. So why were they healed? Well, their nervous system. So it was a psychological thing, right? The dead were only suspended in animation, right? So they weren't really dead. They were in suspended animation, and so they were able to be raised right after their animation ran out. And the feeding of many people were merely involved setting a good example of food sharing. Jesus didn't feed 5,000 people. It was just the example of you should share your food. That's what that miracle is all about, according to Paulus, right?
He was just really good at division. Yes.
Yeah. That's right. So he also says that David Friedrich Strauss, again in the 1800s, explained early Christian miracle stories as myths depicted as history. So they're just myths, but they were depicted as history. He tells us, developed the 18th century emphasis on naturalistic historical explanation, using literary psychological categories to preserve the value of the text. Right. So the text is important while stripping it any unhistorical supernaturalist elements. So the text is important. We should understand it. But, really what's going on are just myths. They're telling us stories. It's not really history.
Right. And so not quite to this extreme, but this is the work that Lydia McGrew has done, who's been on the show before, does with her responses to Mike Licona, and to a lesser degree, I think Gary Habermas as well, of having kind of the genre literature be front and center rather than the apostles were actually expressing what they believed was true history, and they were telling true historical events utilizing the scriptorum devices of their time, and not so much the theory that they're rearranging patterns to make a point that tells the story well or with a false purpose to it. So that comes out here. But we also see this with the Jesus seminar, right? Which I don't think really, I think it was pretty popular in the 80s and 90s. And of course, that's the 1980s and 1990s, which soon is approaching where we actually have to make that clarification. But, this was the idea of, well, Jesus didn't actually walk on the water. He walked by the water. And so it's probably just a bad translation. Yeah, because, when Jesus is walking by the water, of course, the disciples are in fear and awe of what Jesus is doing. No one has ever walked by the water before, especially to some fishermen. I mean, that's outrageous to see. So, we have this type of the cure is almost as worse as the disease itself of trying to fit that explanation, square peg round hole type deal. All right, so by the late 19th century, skepticism regarding supernatural intervention had become dominant even in much of theological academia. So, you want a place at the table, and this is something that...
So you have to give up miracles and supernaturalism.
Right. We have to be thought as serious people, and serious people, you can believe Jesus rose from the dead, but you can't really do that, and you can't think of any of the other ones. So maybe you can fight for the resurrection, but you can't really fight for the Dead Sea, the Red Sea split, or the feeding of the 5,000. So you can't do those ones. But maybe you can do Jesus as a historical person who... Although it could be a myth, right? It could be a exactly.
myth, a story to tell us about, living a new life or something, right?
Yeah, there's a reason that liberalism rose up swiftly during this time period of the early 20th century as well. So yes. Well, despite Adolf Harnack's interest in much historical information in the New Testament, for example, he regarded miracles, angels, apocalyptic prophecy, and the like as non-historical alien intrusions on the New Testament message. So Old Testament, you can have those things, but those things should be wiped out in a serious reading of the New Testament. So this is just your guiding principles of communistic sharing among the early church in Acts, and turning the other cheek. Those are all fine. But Jesus prophesying that he would be raised in 3 days, that's definitely something no serious person takes into consideration.
Yeah, that's history, right? Yeah, that's not history. It's just myth.
Right. You have doctor before your name and a whole bunch of letters after your name, and you can't believe that, because then you wouldn't be a serious person. Well, he doubted nature miracles and the like, while allowing that Jesus' powerful personality may have affected some recoveries. So, the healing of the blind person just really, really wanted to believe that Jesus would heal him. And so, Yeah, he might have had, a knock on the back of his head that suddenly got him to see. So that's how we can explain it. So yeah, he was born blind, but he just had a really personal encounter that really changed him and psychosomatically healed him. So that's what we can attribute to it. Yet it was the metaphysical presuppositions, not empirical evidence, that drove scientism in a naturalistic direction. Which is
so notice
pretty ironic.
The claim is you're not doing science and you're not doing history. You're not trying to, determine what actually happened. You're making metaphysical assumptions and then placing that over what the things that you see and that you find in history, right? And so that's philosophy. That's not science, right? And that's what he's going to say here.
Right.
He asked, is this a sound approach, a frequent reduction of what is real to what is material, right? Only the material is real, right? And thereby excluding explanations like God in the name of science is not the fruit of, and here's the point he's making, empirical science per se, but a philosophical construct. Right? And if a scientist or anyone else dismisses the possibility of supernatural reality, he tells us, then she is offering a metaphysical view, right? That's philosophy, and pontificating on metaphysics, no less than someone who simply assumes the contrary. So, when you make these assumptions, they're metaphysical, they're philosophical assumptions. Just, like they say, follow the evidence. Right?
Yeah, and he does mention this in this chapter too. Is it taking this approach to its fullest extent, you'd have to almost stop science because you could never let anything new come in to upset the status quo. Time is strict. Everyone is governed by the seconds of the clock. So you can't have Einstein come through and say, well, let's see what it's like when we approach the speed of light. We can't have that because that would be overturning what we know. And so having these new things come in, then we're just dismissing them away as, well, it's not current thing. And if it's not current thing, it must be dismissed as this aberration or non-sciency. So
obviously scientism, right? The idea that the only knowledge we have is scientific knowledge, or science is the only thing that gives us knowledge, has the same problems as positivism, right? That statement itself is not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical statement about science. And there are clearly other sources to knowledge than just science, right? And so it has the same problem as we saw in positivism.
Correct. That's where we'll end it for this time. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.